it's the internet. It's the internet. It's the internet, Poppy. It's all those politicats. Yeah, and Jason Isaacs, they're all out there. Say hello, Poppy. It's Poppy the political dash hound. Hey. Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, different screen here. I've forgotten my really cool Surface, and instead I'm recording from my old desktop Mac. So goodness knows how this one's going to turn out, but hopefully it's going to work. This should be a fairly straightforward and fairly short presentation, because what I'm trying to do here is to draw attention to the really important differences that exist between cabinet in America and cabinet in the UK. Do you need to know this? Well, hey, you know what? I was just thinking about this. This might come up as a comparative question, in which case, yes, you bloody well do need to know it. But it's not like the good old days or the bad old days, however you see them, where we used to get a short question and they might ask you about cabinet secretaries and so on. But definitely this is going to help you understand not just how America works, but also how the power dynamics in the UK work. Now, you should remember from my other videos that one of the questions they're going to ask you, or they might ask you in the UK, is where are decisions made within the executive? And of course, the answer to that is it depends. It depends what the Prime Minister wants to, or how the Prime Minister wants to play it. And it also depends what the Cabinet is prepared to put up with. Because in the UK, we have Cabinet government. We have this idea that Cabinet is the supreme executive authority. It's responsible for decision making, and then it's responsible for seeing how those decisions actually play out in the real world. So in the UK, Cabinet has executive authority, and it also has administrative responsibility, and that's massively important, not least because it follows from that Cabinet is the only game in town and everyone wants to play in Cabinet. That gives the Prime Minister a huge amount of his power. If you want to get off the back benches and into Cabinet where decisions are made, or into government generally where decisions are made, you've got to make nice with the whip. You've got to make nice with your leaders. Now, if that's not the case in the United States, then obviously we're playing a very different game, and that is basically the case. And the critical point here, fundamentally important in order to understand how this entire thing fits together, is that in the United States, Cabinet does not have any executive authority. In the UK, we have Cabinet government. In the, whether we run by those rules or not, in theory, at least, we have Cabinet government. Cabinet is the supreme executive authority. In the United States, executive authority is invested in a president, and Cabinet is really just whatever the president wants it to be. Think about Tony Blair in the UK. He was still playing by the rules of Cabinet government, even though Cabinet let him run a system that was, to all intents and purposes, presidential. The nature of the administration was still Cabinet, and in the end, Cabinet got rid of Blair. That can't happen in the United States. The structures don't exist. The nature of power doesn't exist. Remember, in the United States, the president has a direct mandate. And so what that means is that executive authority rests with the president, and he's there to use that as he wishes. Cabinet then is relegated to an administrative role. Now, that's massively important because it diminishes the significance of cabinet posts, and it gives the president less traction when he's trying to put people's feet in the fire. Instead, Cabinet becomes diminished. It has these two roles that, by all means, it plays in the United Kingdom, but not to the same extent, because in the United Kingdom, Cabinet is important. You want people in there because you want their decision-making capability. You want their wisdom. You want their nous. You want their experience. You want their leverage. In the United States, virtually none of that applies. You might find yourself there. Yes, you're there to do an admin job, but you might actually be there simply because of who you are, which particular group you represent. So in terms of identity politics, I always talk about rages. There are many, many more groups that however many want to apply. But if you think of rages, that's REGES. That's religion, age, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. That's going to give you enough to answer any particular question on identity politics in the United States. And in the United States, Cabinet is a means to an end. You are put in there to play to one particular section of society. Look, there's my token, insert identity group of choice. You're also there to serve as a go-between. You're there to serve as a link person between the president and the executive, the rest of the executive, that is the federal bureaucracy, and of course Congress. So you may find that a lot of people in Cabinet, or some people in Cabinet, will be people with extended congressional careers. Inevitably, people are coming towards the end of that congressional career because you don't join cabinet unless you can see the end from where you are. Cabinet is a terminal gig. There's only one way out of cabinet, and it's not back into Congress. It's into retirement. So that's the nature of cabinet. And again, you're probably not going to get a short question on this, but just get your head around the point that in the United States, cabinet is a diminished role. Cabinet cannot get rid of the president in the same way that the cabinet can get rid of the prime minister. Now, I know we've got the 25th Amendment. That's absolutely valid, but that's only in the case of medical incapacity. In the United Kingdom, cabinet can wake up on a bad day and just say, you know what, enough of your rubbish, and get rid of the prime minister. They can't do that in the United States because, again, the president has won the election. They have supreme executive authority, and that rests with them and them as an individual. So what then is the role of the cabinet secretary in the United States? Now, I'm going back here to Chuck Hagel because, as ever with Trump, we've basically taken the model and we've smashed it and we've thrown it out the window and then we've torched whatever's left. What is the cabinet secretary for in the United States right now? I have no idea. Ask Trump. And for a second, don't bother because you won't get a coherent answer. Traditionally, what the cabinet secretary is there to do is, the cabinet secretary is there to run their department. So in the case of Hagel, he ran the Pentagon for 3 years, and that is a monumental undertaking. You think of the number of people and the budget that the Pentagon employs. There are countries that spend half as much, a quarter, a third as much in a year as the Pentagon blows in 6 months. So the defense secretary there is responsible for running one of the biggest organizations in the entire world, and that is a significant undertaking in and of itself. In terms of what he tells the Pentagon to do, then obviously he's going to take a feed from the president. So the president will feed policy. The president will feed policy into the executive position, normally through the mechanism of executive orders, and then those executive orders are passed on to the administrative entity. If you don't know what executive orders are, then there's a presentation for that. And if I remember to do my links, I will link off to that. Links. Remember. Right. So the defense secretary there is to run the Defense Department and, of course, to tell the Defense Department what it is that the president would like them to do. Does he give advice to the president? Well, sometimes, but the president doesn't have to listen. Again, this is not like the United Kingdom. Cabinet doesn't meet on a regular basis. Cabinet meets when the president wants to meet it, and any advice facility that the Secretary of State might deploy is entirely personal and not down to the nature of the office. The president relies much more heavily on the advice of his advisors. And here we can see, I think that's Andrew Card explaining to President George W. Bush, or George Bush 43, that 2 planes have just flown into the Trade Center. So there you go. The president will rely much more on his executive office, on the White House staff for his advice. And again, this is really just a one-way street. Advice goes that way, policy goes that way. The other thing that the Hagel has to do, or that the defense secretary has to do, is to liaise with Congress. Again, this is why sometimes it's useful to have a Secretary of State who has a cabinet secretary or secretary who has some degree of experience with Congress and ties with Congress, because they're going to have to take that policy to Congress and explain what the president would like them to do, like as a nod. The legislation, of course, then comes back from Congress. The president isn't going to do it. He's got many, many better things to do. And so the job of implementing that policy, again, falls to the Secretary of State. And they have to take that legislation and make sure that that the department is doing what it wants to do, the department is doing what Congress is doing, and then, of course, explain that to the president that he didn't get the legislation that he wanted because presumably the defense secretary failed to get Congress to bend to the president's will. So, yeah, that's pretty rubbish. And there's one more thing that he has to do. Again, is the president accountable? Is there any layer of accountability in terms of exop to the president? Well, to a certain extent. But the real layer of accountability, it's not the president to them. It's really the way in which the Secretary of State will carry the can for specific policies in front of Congress. The president again hands this policy on to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State runs it, and then if it all goes spectacularly south, he has to account for it in front of the congressional committees. The president may later be hauled in for bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors, but in terms of specific policies, he's not going to take the blame for that. He's going to hand that on to his to the secretary, and so that's a pretty thankless task, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now, the one exception that does prove the rule is the Bush 43 administration, and here what we had was a network of neoconservatives who, between them, got together to steer the executive from the back seat. And basically, you're looking at these people here, hardcore neoconservatives whose job it was to basically manipulate Bush to make sure that he made the decision that they wanted him to make. Now, again, I say this is the exception that proves the rule, but again, in the case of Trump, all bets are off. We're not entirely sure how he's running his cabinet, if he's running his cabinet. It just seems like chaos. And I think I linked off to a few presentations on that, a few articles on that on an earlier presentation. If I remember, I'll do the same here. So, what's it like to be a Secretary of State in the United States or a Cabinet Secretary in the United States? Well, pretty bloody awful, really. You're there perhaps because of the particular demographic you represent. You might be there because you're good at running a department, in which case, hey, that's actually progress. You might be there to liaise between the president and the other entities within the state, but largely you're there to carry the can for presidential policy, for executive policy, particularly if it goes south. And that's summed up by Gates. Now, Gates was in post before Chuck Hagel, and he summed up his position thus. When Hagel eventually resigned, it took Obama months to replace him. And that kind of begs the question, imagine if the defense secretary in the UK resigned. How long do you think it would take for the prime minister to replace him? The ink would not be dry on the resignation letter, or the letter accepting the resignation before that post was filled. Whereas in the America, Trump started his cabinet, started his administration with about half of his cabinet seats empty. I don't think cabinet has ever been more than 60%, 70% full under Trump, because it just doesn't work the same way as it does in the UK. That's it for now. I'm going to kill that one right now. Poppy, the political dachshund, is going to bed, and we will see you next time. Okay? Thanks for your attention. You know where to find me. If you like the videos, please do tell me. If you don't, tell me that as well. Tell me how I can make these better, and we'll get to work on that straight away. I'm going to let the music fade out, and I'll see you on the other side.